My wrist. It aches so much.
At 5 a.m. in 1860, in a cold London basement, a young maid named Hannah Calvik drops to her knees before a massive cast-iron fireplace. Her hands are covered in caked-on soot, and she faces 16 hours of non-stop, grueling labor that remains completely invisible to her employers. At the same time, on the upper floors of the luxurious mansion, the owners are sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the true cost of their comfort. Hollywood directors have diligently erased this reality from their glossy TV series, replacing it with a fairy tale friendship between the aristocracy and the servants. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how the daily lives of Victorian workers differed from the on-screen portrayal, and why the creators of popular shows deliberately distort the past. What is commonly regarded as the golden age of the British aristocracy was, in reality, built on a brutal system of social isolation. The creators of popular historical dramas carefully conceal authentic documents from that era from viewers in order to preserve an appealing television myth. The information you'll hear today will completely change your perception of your favorite period dramas and make you look at every scene in a new light. We'll reveal a secret that the entertainment industry has guarded for decades to sell the illusion of a beautiful and carefree life. Today, a true picture of Victorian life will unfold before you, based on reliable documents and the personal diaries of workers. You'll see the real difference between the fictional lavish dinners of TV footmen and the meager rations of real maids. We'll follow the lives of specific people from that era, whose real voices have been erased from modern scripts. Instead of contrived romantic intrigues, we'll show a world where every action was governed by a strict schedule and rigid regulations. This will be a deep dive into a hidden reality that long remained in the shadows of glittering ballrooms. In popular TV series, we regularly see spacious, well-lit kitchens where servants gather around a large table for long conversations. Actual 19th century architecture was built on a completely different principle, the main goal of which was to completely conceal the service staff. Houses were designed in a specific way so that the paths of wealthy owners and ordinary workers would never cross in daily life. To achieve this, engineers implemented a complex system of hidden staircases, dark, narrow corridors, and underground passageways. This architectural illusion created the impression for guests of a self-sustaining space where absolute comfort seemed to appear as if by magic. The social divide between the floors was enforced by strict rules that completely ruled out any informal interaction. Encountering the owner in the hallway was considered a gross breach of discipline and could result in a severe reprimand. If a maid heard the homeowner's footsteps approaching, she was required to immediately turn her back to the wall. The staff had to remain completely invisible, like ghosts inhabiting the hidden corridors of the enormous stone building. Television scenes in which a maid chats amiably with a count in the library would, in reality, have led to immediate dismissal. The servants' quarters were traditionally located below ground level, forming a completely separate underground world. These semi-basement rooms were plagued by constant dampness, cold drafts, and a severe lack of fresh air. Small windows were situated right under the ceilings, letting in only dim light from the street sidewalks or from enclosed courtyards. It was in these harsh conditions that the lives of the people responsible for maintaining the impeccable splendor of the upper, formal floors unfolded. The lack of proper lighting and ventilation made the long hours of physical labor even more exhausting and extremely harmful to their health. This spatial separation fostered a unique group dynamic among the underground workers themselves. Deprived of access to the outside world, they created their own closed society with its own unspoken rules. Within this insular community, complex relationships of mutual aid, competition, and strict hierarchy developed. Overcoming daily hardships together brought people closer than any contrived television conflict ever could. They learnt to communicate without words, conveying important information through a system of code signals and fleeting glances. Historical documents indicate that not even sounds from the basement were allowed to reach the upper floors. The doors leading to the master's quarters were lined with thick woolen cloth for maximum soundproofing. The bells used to summon servants were tuned to different pitches so that the staff would know exactly which room to rush to. This complex mechanical system replaced genuine human interaction, reducing servants to nameless functions. A servant's voice was heard in the master's quarters only in the event of a direct order or a brief, formal reply. The layout of the staff bedrooms also differed radically from the cozy rooms depicted in movies. Dozens of people were crammed into tiny cubbyholes in the attics, where the heat was unbearable in the summer and water froze in the jugs in the winter. They had no personal space, no individual closets, and no opportunity to be alone after a hard day's work. Beds were often shared on a rotating basis, and personal belongings were stored in small wooden chests under the bunks. It was a life under constant collective surveillance, where any secret became known to all roommates. The architecture of invisibility also dictated specific routes for moving through the enormous mansion. Cleaning of the reception rooms had to be finished before the owners came down for morning tea. The maids glided through the house in the pre-dawn twilight, dusting and stoking the fireplaces in absolute silence. Her first few weeks were spent endlessly wandering through the dark labyrinths of the basement levels of the unfamiliar mansion. She quickly learned the main rule of survival. The less the owners notice you, the longer you'll keep your job. Her diary entries would later become the most candid testimony to how this ruthless system functioned. Thus, the majestic English estates were more like complex industrial enterprises than cozy family homes. Architecture served as a powerful tool of social control, cementing an insurmountable chasm between the classes on a physical level. By understanding the design of these buildings, we begin to see through the falsehood of romanticized television narratives. I'd love to hear your perspective. What do you think about this system of strict architectural isolation that kept people apart? Share your thoughts in the comments. In 1861, a young woman named Isabella Beeton published a book that forever changed British domestic life. Her work, The Book of Household Management, became an absolute bestseller and the undisputed rulebook for the entire country. In the pages of this massive volume, she laid out in detail every step, every duty, and every breath of the domestic staff. It was this very document that established the very same unattainable standards that Hollywood today passes off as the natural order of things. Isabella Beeton had never worked as a maid, yet she assumed the right to dictate their living conditions. She approached household management as if it were the management of a military campaign, with the mistress serving as commander-in-chief. In her book, the staff were described not as living people, but as cogs in a vast machine of comfort. She established strict time limits for every task, from cleaning the silverware to polishing the brass doorknobs. These rules turned daily routines into an endless race against time, one that was physically impossible to win. According to Mrs. Beeton's instructions, the ideal maid was expected to possess qualities incompatible with human nature. She was required to be absolutely silent, invisible, unfailingly reliable, and completely devoid of personal interests. The book prescribed starting work long before dawn and finishing only after the employers had gone to bed. At the same time, the maid was always expected to look fresh, alert, and ready to fulfill any whim. TV series readily use this image of the smiling maid, forgetting to mention the price of such a demeanor. The instructions covered not only work duties, but also the moral conduct of hired workers. Beeton strictly forbade staff from engaging in romantic relationships, receiving guests, or spending their rare hours of leisure in a boisterous manner. She recommended that employers regularly inspect the maid's personal belongings to prevent potential theft or inappropriate behavior. This total control deprived people of their basic right to privacy and human dignity. In reality, such bureaucratic tyranny led to immense psychological pressure within the closed-off community. In her diaries, Hannah Calvik often described the absurdity of these textbook requirements when applied to the grimy reality of the basement. While theorists like Isabella Beeton discussed elegant table settings, Hannah spent hours scrubbing ingrained grease off enormous kitchen stoves. Her hands were covered in deep cracks from the caustic cleaning agents that went unmentioned in the elegant manuals. She saw young women break under the weight of the impossible expectations imposed by popular literature. For ordinary working women, Mrs. Beeton's book was not a helper, but a cruel overseer. One of the most cynical aspects of this guide was its calculation of the financial costs of maintaining staff. Beeton meticulously calculated the minimum acceptable nutritional standards to save the employer's money. She advised buying the cheapest cuts of meat for the kitchen and strictly limiting the rationing of tea and sugar. Over time, Isabella Beeton's standards became an unquestioned tradition that shaped the fate of several generations. The system, designed to bring order, became an instrument of institutionalized social oppression and exploitation. People like Hannah Calvik sacrificed their youth and health to maintain an artificial image of perfection. They became hostages to rules written by those who had never once in their lives held a mop in their hands. This paper tyranny proved far more enduring than stone walls and iron bars. We see that behind the beautiful facade of impeccable service lay a cruel system of regulating people's lives. The ideals found in books were shattered by the harsh reality of hard physical labor and constant malnutrition. But what exactly did the diet look like for those who prepared lavish banquets for high society every day? In movies, servants regularly gather around a generously set table, enjoying hot meat and fresh pastries. The reality was quite different. The staff's meals were strictly regulated and funded on a residual basis. The gastronomic chasm between the floors was so great that the inhabitants of a single house ate as if they belonged to different civilizations. While pheasants and French wines were being served upstairs, stale bread and thin soup were being shared in the basement. According to strict rules, servants were categorically forbidden from touching the leftovers from their master's meals. Even if delicacies remained untouched after a lavish banquet, they were not brought down to the staff table. These items were either repurposed for the master's next meals or sold by the cook on the black market. An attempt by a maid to eat a half-eaten piece of pie from the master's table was considered theft and carried the threat of immediate dismissal. This zero-tolerance policy artificially perpetuated the semi-starved existence of people surrounded by an abundance of food. The diet of a typical 19th century worker consisted mainly of the cheapest, carbohydrate-rich foods. They were given huge portions of potatoes, stale bread, a little cheap cheese, and a minimal amount of lard. Meat appeared on the servants' table extremely rarely, and when it did, it consisted of the worst cuts, full of sinews and bones. Fresh vegetables and fruits were considered an unaffordable luxury and were practically absent from the daily menu. Such a meager diet failed miserably to replenish the energy expended during long hours of hard physical labor. Tea, which we now consider a symbol of British comfort, was rationed strictly by weight once a week. It was the cheapest variety, brewed several times until the water became almost clear. Sugar was also strictly rationed, and many had to drink plain boiling water to save their rations. In her diaries, Hannah Calvik recalled how carefully she gathered every single spilled tea leaf from the table. These tiny reserves were the only joy in the endless succession of monotonous and exhausting workdays. On large estates, a separate low-ranking cook was responsible for preparing meals for the servants. Her task was not to create delicious dishes, but to ensure maximum savings for the household. Meals were often cooked in huge cauldrons without any spices, resulting in a grey colour and a bland taste. The quality of these dishes depended entirely on the integrity of the housekeeper, who allocated the budget for purchases. In unscrupulous households, the staff was systematically undernourished, leading to widespread illness and chronic fatigue. This food system periodically sparked covert but fierce resistance within the staff. Historical documents record instances of actual potato riots when servants refused to eat spoiled food. They banded together to protest against the blatantly rotten potatoes or spoiled meat served for lunch. Such acts of defiance required incredible courage, as the ringleaders risked not only their jobs, but also their reputations. However, hunger and despair often outweighed the fear of the all-powerful masters and their overseers. For many, the only salvation lay in the secret solidarity and mutual aid among the kitchen workers. Cooks, risking their jobs, would sometimes secretly pass pieces of meat or fresh bread to the most emaciated maids. This gastronomic injustice left a deep mark on the health of an entire generation of workers. Chronic malnutrition, combined with a lack of sunlight and fresh air, led to premature aging. Young women who entered service as blossoming peasant girls were transformed into emaciated women within a few years. Their pale faces and thin figures were a direct consequence of the frugality promoted by Mrs. Beeton. The illusion of well-fed and contented domestic servants, created by the movies, crumbles at the first encounter with the facts. The restrictions applied not only to food, but also to appearance, which was strictly regulated by rules. The lack of energy was exacerbated by the fact that workers had to wear extremely uncomfortable and heavy clothing. In the next chapter, you'll learn why the traditional uniform was not merely a badge of distinction, but a genuine instrument of physical restraint. The classic black and white maid's dress with a starched bonnet is considered a symbol of purity and British order. On screen, this outfit looks elegant, emphasizing the neatness and professionalism of the show's characters. However, in the reality of the Victorian era, the uniform functioned as a rigid corset, restricting not only movement, but also individuality. It was designed not for the worker's comfort, but to demonstrate her employer's status and maintain strict discipline. Traditional work dresses were made from the cheapest and densest varieties of coarse wool or stiff cotton. This material did not allow air to pass through, causing the young women to suffer from overheating in stuffy rooms during the summer. The multi-layered skirts were incredibly heavy, especially when they got wet while doing laundry or mopping floors. The bulky clothing snagged on furniture, hindered quick movement through narrow hallways, and required constant tugging. Instead of making physical labor easier, the uniform turned every simple movement into an additional test of endurance. The mandatory starched collars, cuffs, and snow-white aprons were a particular instrument of torture. Keeping them in pristine condition required long hours of washing, boiling, starching, and ironing with heavy cast iron irons. The slightest stain on the white fabric could result in a fine or a harsh reprimand from the head housekeeper. The stiff edges of the collars rubbed the neck until it turned red, and the tight cuffs prevented the arms from bending freely while cleaning. This ostentatious cleanliness was achieved at the cost of constant physical pain and calluses hidden beneath the clothing. The bonnet, which covered the hair, was not merely a matter of hygiene, but an important symbol of subordination. It stripped a woman of her individuality, erasing her personal traits and turning her into a standardized, faceless member of the staff. The rules strictly prohibited the use of any jewelry or bright ribbons, or altering the style of the uniform. A young woman was not allowed to wear her hair down or use even the most modest cosmetics. Her appearance served as a constant reminder that her body and time belonged entirely to the household's owners. In her journals, Hannah Calvik described in detail the process of her transformation from a free young woman into a domestic servant. As she put on her uniform, she felt as if, along with the buttons, an invisible lock was fastening her social bondage. She deliberately soiled her hands with ash, finding in this dirt a peculiar form of protest against the artificial whiteness of the aprons. For her, skin blackened by soot became a symbol of real, honest labor, in contrast to the starched falseness of the upper floors. Her diaries document this daily conflict between an imposed outward appearance and an inner need for self-expression. In addition to the standard dress code, there were strict rules regarding the footwear of service staff. Maids were required to wear heavy leather boots with flat soles, which were often issued already worn out. These shoes rarely fit properly, causing severe pain in the feet after 16 hours of continuous walking. Silent movement was ensured by special fabric pads, that the young women sewed onto the soles themselves. Thus, even the servants' footsteps were meant to remain inaudible to the keen ears of the vacationing aristocrats. Changing uniforms throughout the day was a separate, exhausting ritual prescribed by the Code of Conduct. For dirty morning work, they wore dresses made of coarse blue or grey fabric that concealed soot stains. Only late at night, in the cramped confines of their cold attics, could the young women shed this heavy armour. The moment of liberation from tight collars and stiff corsets was a brief return to their own selves. However, just a few hours later, they would have to put on their government-issued dress again and become silent shadows. This continuous, cyclical loss of self left deep psychological scars on the souls of these young women. The uniform was not merely clothing, it was a powerful tool for erasing human individuality. Despite the heavy clothing and constant fatigue, people tried to maintain their sanity within this closed system. In the next chapter, you'll learn exactly how Hannah Calvik and other female workers found hidden ways to resist. Hannah Calvik was not a celebrity, a politician, or an aristocrat, but her legacy turned historians' perceptions of the past upside down. As a simple dishwasher and menial maid, she kept a detailed secret diary for decades. Unlike the polished memoirs of the aristocracy, her entries smell of damp basements, laundry soap, and coal dust. It is her text that shatters the cinematic myth of the cheerful and carefree inhabitants of the lower floors. For Hannah, keeping a diary was an act of incredible civic and personal courage. She had to write late at night by the dim light of a candle stub, hiding her notebook from the housekeeper's prying eyes. The slightest suspicion that an illiterate servant was keeping a record of life in the household would have led to her dismissal. Exhaustion after 16 hours of back-breaking labor would knock her off her feet, but she stubbornly scrawled out letters with her calloused fingers. These pages became the only space for her where she was not merely a function, but a thinking human being. A turning point in her life was an unusual encounter with Arthur Manby, a wealthy London gentleman. He was obsessed with studying the lives of working women and asked Hannah to document her every workday. Their relationship was complex, secretive, and deeply contradictory, crossing all the unthinkable class boundaries of the time. Manby acted as a researcher, but it was Hannah who became the true chronicler of her own harsh reality. She described not political events, but the number of buckets of coal carried up steep steps during a shift. Hannah's diaries mercilessly document the physical consequences of her many years spent in an architectural dungeon. She matter-of-factly describes the constant pain in her joints from kneeling while scrubbing stone floors. Her writings are devoid of romanticism. They are dry accounts of hands rubbed raw, frostbitten fingers, and chronic sleep deprivation. She reveals a world where a person's worth is measured solely by their ability to endure filth and heavy labor. There is no television-style lightness in her words, only the dull, rhythmic cadence of hard physical labor. But the most remarkable thing about Hannah's writings is the absence of a victim mentality and her striking inner dignity. She found a peculiar, grim pride in her ability to perform the dirtiest and most physically demanding work. While other girls fainted from exhaustion, Hannah drew strength from her incredible endurance. She consciously rejected Manby's attempts to civilize her, preferring to remain a rough, strong, and independent worker. This inner freedom paradoxically flourished amid conditions of total external slavery and control. She described in detail the hidden solidarity that arose among the women in moments of greatest strain. When the housekeeper forced them to rewash all the dishes because of a single mistake, the girls silently stood shoulder to shoulder. In those basements, there was no room for fine words, but there was room for quiet, life-saving mutual support. Hannah shared her meagre rations with the newcomers, who were not yet accustomed to the brutal rhythm of London mansions. These acts of humanity were the only light in the impenetrable darkness of the daily, exhausting routine. They witnessed the weaknesses, secrets, and hypocrisy of their employers, all while remaining invisible observers. Hannah's diaries are the voice of those whom Hollywood prefers to portray merely as tea servers. They are a documentary record of an era, written not in ink, but in sweat and coal dust. But even from people as strong as Hannah, the system tried to take away the very last thing they had, their free time. How exactly were those rare hours of rest regulated, and why was a day off often worse than a workday? In TV series, we see servants gathering in the pub in the evening, playing cards, or strolling through the park. This portrayal creates the false impression that, after their shift, workers managed their time as free people. In reality, the concept of free time for Victorian domestic servants practically did not exist, either legally or in practice. A person's life belonged to their employer 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Officially, servants were granted 1 day off per month, as well as half of Sunday to attend church. However, even these rare hours of rest were strictly regulated and subject to numerous restrictions. A servant could not simply leave the grounds of the mansion. He had to obtain written permission from the house manager. At the same time, the housekeeper strictly inspected the servant's appearance before he left to ensure that his clothing was appropriate for his humble status. Any tardiness, even by 10 minutes, was punished with hefty fines and at times immediate termination of the contract. Hollywood loves romantic storylines between servants, but in reality, such relationships were strictly forbidden. Any sign of affection between a footman and a maid meant immediate dismissal for both, with no hope of a reference. Attending church on Sunday, presented as a day of rest, was in fact yet another form of control. Servants were required to sit in specially designated back pews, demonstrating their submission not only to their employers, but also to God. After the service, they were not allowed to linger to socialize with townspeople and had to return to work immediately. Sunday lunch for the employers required no less effort than on weekdays, turning the day of rest into a mockery. Religion was used as an additional tool to instill obedience and resignation to their difficult lot. Hannah Calvik described how she used her rare free hours for secret meetings with Arthur Manby. These brief forays into the city were fraught with enormous risk, but they gave her a much-needed sense of freedom. She would take off her bonnet, blend in with the crowd of London passers-by, and for a few hours cease to be a maid. But every time she returned to the back entrance of the mansion, she felt the invisible cage slam shut again. The price of these rare moments of freedom was incredibly high. We see that total control extended not only to work duties, but also to people's very souls. The system left no room for a personal life, turning people into round-the-clock appendages of a vast household. But how were relationships regulated within the servants' community itself? It might seem that shared oppression would have united all the inhabitants of the basement into a single, close-knit family. However, the reality of Victorian mansions was far more complex and cynical than what is portrayed in feel-good movies. Within the servants' community, there existed its own incredibly harsh and ruthless caste system. This invisible hierarchy mirrored the class prejudices of the masters, turning the basement into a mirror image of aristocratic society. At the top of this basement hierarchy sat the butler and the head housekeeper, who wielded almost unlimited power. They dined at a separate table, were served the finest food, and were addressed with the utmost respect. The butler wore an elegant tailcoat, looking almost indistinguishable from the gentleman he served. These senior servants often distanced themselves from menial tasks, delegating them to lower-ranking staff. They zealously guarded their privileges, relishing their power over the dozens of people under their command. Conflicts within this hierarchy were often more intense than clashes between the master class and the servants. Senior servants, eager to curry favor with their employers, often became the harshest overseers of the younger staff. They imposed fines for the slightest infractions, reported violations, and created an atmosphere of total mistrust. Young girls feared the head cook's wrath more than they feared the lady of the house's displeasure. The system was designed so that the workers would monitor one another, relieving the aristocrats of this unpleasant task. Hannah Calvik's diaries are full of descriptions of this complex internal tension among the staff of London households. She deliberately turned down promotions, preferring to remain a manual labourer so as not to participate in the hypocritical games of the senior servants. Her status as a low-ranking servant gave her a paradoxical freedom. She was not expected to display refined manners or flattery. She witnessed how power changes people, transforming former peasant women into haughty and cruel overseers. Her conscious refusal to participate in the career race was yet another form of silent protest against the system. This rigid hierarchy benefited the masters, as a divided workforce could not unite to revolt. Mutual suspicion and the struggle for petty privileges prevented the workers from realizing that they shared common interests. The system regulated itself by exploiting human weaknesses, pride, and the fear of losing one's small advantage. Understanding these inner workings shatters the myth of a united and friendly family of servants portrayed on television shows. But how was this backbreaking labor compensated, the kind for which people were willing to endure such humiliation? In movies, we often hear characters planning to save their wages and start their own small business. Viewers are led to believe that having room and board provided allowed servants to save nearly all the money they earned. However, actual accounting records from the Victorian era reveal a ruthless system of economic traps and hidden deductions. Most workers left their jobs just as destitute as when they had entered them many years earlier. The official base salary for a maid or dishwasher doing menial labor was pitifully low, even by 19th century standards. But even this meager pay was rarely paid in full due to a complex system of internal fines and deductions. A housekeeper could deduct part of a servant's pay for an accidentally broken cup, a ruined bar of soap, or insufficient diligence. The servant had no right to challenge these decisions, as employment contracts were drafted exclusively in the employer's favor. As a result, at the end of the month, servants were paid mere pennies, barely enough to cover their basic personal needs. A significant portion of their earnings went toward maintaining the very impeccable appearance demanded by their employers. In many households, servants were required to purchase uniform items, shoes, and special cleaning supplies at their own expense. Constant washing quickly wore out the fabrics, requiring regular and quite substantial financial outlays. The young women spent their last pennies on stiff brushes and caustic soda to meet Mrs. Beeton's standards. The system was structured so that the worker herself paid for the tools used to oppress her. Another major expense was providing assistance to impoverished relatives who remained in villages or working-class neighborhoods. Most young women entered domestic service, not for the sake of a career, but to save their families from starvation. They regularly sent most of their meager wages to their aging parents or younger siblings. This sense of duty and responsibility completely deprived them of the ability to save for their own future. They sacrificed their health and their money, remaining trapped in an endless cycle of generational poverty. Hannah Calvik meticulously recorded all her income and expenses, revealing the alarming economic instability of her situation. Illness was the greatest fear of any wage earner, since medical care was not covered by the employer. If a maid fell ill from damp conditions and overwork, she was not merely deprived of her wages for the days she missed. In the event of a prolonged illness, she was immediately thrown out onto the street to free up a bed for a healthy replacement. There were, in principle, no pensions, insurance, or severance pay for this class of citizens. Only a handful, those with exceptional business acumen or who had received an unexpected inheritance, managed to save enough to start their own business. For the overwhelming majority, the domestic service system was an economic dead end with only one way out: death. They worked surrounded by unimaginable luxury, polishing silver to a shine every day, silver that was worth more than their own lives. This proximity to wealth made their own poverty even more stark and psychologically unbearable. Hollywood sells us a beautiful fairy tale, ignoring the cold, hard math of Victorian exploitation. The realization of this financial hopelessness often drove people to petty theft or involvement in shady schemes. Cooks received kickbacks from butchers, and footmen took tips from guests for small favors, risking their jobs. This wasn't because they were living the good life, but rather a desperate attempt to compensate for the injustice of the official wage system. The economic trap shaped a unique moral code in which deceiving a wealthy employer was considered not a crime, but a restoration of justice. Despite all these hardships, people did not turn into soulless robots. Find out in the next chapter how they preserved their humanity under the most inhuman conditions. Despite architectural isolation, bureaucratic tyranny, the economic trap, and total control, the workers retained their dignity. The system did everything it could to turn them into faceless cogs, but human nature resisted this pressure. In the dark corridors of Victorian mansions, a daily, quiet struggle, unseen by the masters, unfolded for the right to be a person. This struggle was not accompanied by loud slogans. It consisted of small but extremely important acts of defiance. The servants had masterfully learned to use their invisibility as their primary weapon against their haughty employers. The masters, accustomed to ignoring the staff, often engaged in candid conversations in their presence, forgetting to exercise caution. As a result, the basement dwellers knew absolutely everything about the residents of the upper floors, their debts, secrets, and shameful secrets. This power of information gave the workers a hidden sense of superiority over those who considered them second-class citizens. Knowing others' weaknesses helped them maintain their self-respect, realizing that the aristocrats were not as perfect as they wanted to appear. The underground's internal culture was rife with sharp humor and biting satire aimed at the lifestyle of high society. Behind the closed doors of the kitchen, the servants masterfully parodied the manners, gait, and speech of their arrogant masters. Laughter was the best remedy for fatigue and a defense mechanism against daily psychological humiliations. These moments of shared merriment erased the imposed hierarchy, transforming exhausted people into lively, sarcastic, and intelligent observers. Hollywood rarely depicts this sharp class-based humor, preferring safe and shallow jokes. Hannah Calvik found her dignity in her absolute and honest acceptance of her difficult physical lot. She did not try to appear to be someone else, rejecting the false values of a world built on the labor of others. For her, a freshly scrubbed floor was not a symbol of slavery, but proof of her personal strength and professional skill. She took pride in her broad shoulders and calloused hands, considering them a badge of honor for a true working person. Hidden within this somber pride lay a powerful independence that no housekeeper could break. A special act of resistance was the preservation of their cultural roots and dialects, brought from their home villages. The housekeepers demanded proper London pronunciation, but in the basement, people continued to speak in their native dialects. Preserving their language was a way to avoid being absorbed into the faceless mass of standard service staff. It was their connection to home, to the past, to a world where they were not merely maids, but daughters and sisters. Language became an invisible shield, protecting the core of their identity from dissolving into the institutional environment. Hannah Calvik's diaries are, in and of themselves, the greatest act of such covert historical resistance. By recording her every step, she refused to be erased from memory like millions of her nameless predecessors. She understood that her testimony was more important than the flowery words written by theorists like Mrs. Beeton. By preserving the truth about the dirt, sweat, and exhaustion, Hannah defended the dignity of her entire class. Her writings became a time bomb that shattered the idyllic myth of the Victorian era many decades later. We see that behind the facade of submission lay a vibrant, complex, and deeply human world. People did not give up. They adapted, found loopholes, and survived while maintaining their self-respect. Now we will see how this story ended. Let's return to the scene from 1860. Hannah Calvik is kneeling in front of a cast iron fireplace, scrubbing away the caked-on soot. At first glance, this is a picture of a person's utter defeat in the face of the ruthless machine of social stratification. But now, Knowing about her diaries, her secret pride, and her strength, we view this episode in a completely different light. This isn't just slave labor, it's a moment in the making of documentary history, a moment when an invisible worker becomes the primary witness of an era. Hannah Calvik's path led her neither to wealth nor to the classic fairy tale rescue so beloved in movies. She secretly married Arthur Manby, but flatly refused to live with him as a traditional lady. She continued to do menial work because it was in labor that she saw her true essence and independence. Hannah refused to let the aristocratic world swallow her up, remaining true to her working-class roots until the end of her days. Her choice was a triumph of personal freedom over imposed social roles and societal expectations. The domestic service system, which had seemed unshakable in the 19th century, began to collapse rapidly with the outbreak of World War I. Women, who had been confined to basements for centuries, found work in factories, earning a real wage and working set hours. Massive mansions, designed to be staffed by hundreds of people, stood empty and became economically unviable for their now bankrupt owners. The architecture of invisibility lost its meaning when the invisible people left these dark labyrinths en masse, never to return. A new era dawned, in which Mrs. Beeton's bureaucratic tyranny became a historical curiosity. The creators of the series Downton Abbey and other historical dramas know this truth, but they consciously choose to tell a fairy tale. They romanticize the era because viewers want to see beautiful dresses, not a dishwasher's hands stained with blood. Hollywood uses the settings of the past, completely stripping them of pain, exploitation, and class injustice. This is a commercial decision that sells a comfortable nostalgia for a time that never actually existed. Realizing this, we must learn to separate the glossy world of television from the harsh and complex reality of history. Hannah Calvik's diaries have survived to the present day, overcoming the passage of time, oblivion, and class prejudices. Her uneven handwriting and raw descriptions of daily life have proved more enduring than the immaculate facades of many London mansions. She reached her ultimate destination. From an invisible servant whose lot was nothing but filth, she became the voice of an era. Her life proves that true history is not made in grand ballrooms, but in dark corridors by those who do the dirty work. Hannah defeated the system by forcing us to learn and remember the truth. This truth should not fill us with despondency. It should inspire deep respect for human resilience. By studying the real lives of the past, we pay tribute to the millions of people whose labor paid for the progress of civilization. We remove their artificial, starched bonnets and restore their authentic, complex human faces. History does not need Hollywood embellishments to be captivating, dramatic, and truly great. It is our duty to look at the past with open eyes, unafraid to shatter sweet television myths. Ultimately, the truth about Victorian servants is a story of how human dignity can sprout even through a stone floor. We've seen just how far Hannah Calvik has come, from a dark basement to the pages of historical research. Do you agree? Please share your thoughts on this topic and suggest topics for future videos you'd like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe.